Carolyn Hewson. Just under 58 years ago in Adelaide, there was much excitement in the Somerville household when their baby daughter named Carolyn Judith was born. Tell me a little about your parents.
Oh, thank you, Frank. My parents married at a very early age, unlike me. My dad was born in 1929, my mum in 1931, and as a very young dental student, my dad married my mum, who was a secretary in the medical faculty at the University of Adelaide. And I came along when they were 22 and 24, and they had an extremely happy 47-year marriage, and I was blessed with 2 sisters and one of those idyllic upbringings.
Well, so you went to school at Presbyterian Ladies College, which later became Seymour College. And did you enjoy your time at school?
I loved school. I went to the same school all my life. I revelled in sport. I wish I could say to you that I studied incredibly hard. I studied as hard as I could, but really my passion at that time was tennis and hockey and a multiple number of activities that kept me very busy, but a great schooling.
So when you matriculated, what sort of career did you have in mind?
Well, I had always wanted to be a pharmacist, and I got into pharmacy. I was accepted, and it was one day before university applications closed, and suddenly I decided I don't think I do want to be a pharmacist, with absolutely no plan as to what to do from there. So I then enrolled at university, and I did half arts and half science. I studied maths, and I went to a new topic that I had never, ever even known anything about, economics 1 and 2, and I discovered in that first year of university economics, and that was really the beginning of the rest of my career. I loved economics. It provided me a framework for thinking and the way that I approach life, and I consider myself extremely lucky. I'm sure I would have been happy as a pharmacist, but to have discovered economics opened for me a whole new world.
Well, one of your teachers at the University of Adelaide was the eminent economist Professor Jeff Harcourt, and he had a strong connection with the University of Cambridge because he completed his doctorate there, as I remember, and then later on, after leaving the University of Adelaide, he taught there. Was he the one that influenced you to do your postgraduate degree there?
Frank, you've obviously done a lot of homework, because Jeff Harcourt was truly instrumental in my understanding of economics and guiding me. So I'll tell you a little bit about where it began and how Jeff came to guide me and inspire me. But in the first year, economics had not been offered at my school, so I was doing these subjects called macro and microeconomics. I had absolutely no idea what they were talking about in that first term, and I noted at the end of that term there were 2 exams. I had no idea that they were split into macro and micro, and Jeff took me aside in that early day and explained that the Tuesday lectures were micro and the Thursday lectures were macro, and you needed to understand that distinction. So he took me under his wing at an early age, and I guess you could say I blossomed with economics. He then said to me at the end of my honours year, "What are you going to do?" And like most Australians, I said, or young Australians, I said, "I'm going to travel next year. I'm just taking off overseas." And he said, "Oh no, you're not. Oh no, you're not. You are going to apply to Oxford and Cambridge, and you will go, hopefully, to Cambridge." And that's how it came about. So he is still a great friend. He's been an academic mentor for a long time. And unfortunately, he was back in Australia when I was studying at Cambridge, but he's still a great friend.
And you came back to Australia straight after graduating?
I came back, yes. It's hard to admit now when I see all these young people travelling overseas and staying overseas for 10 and 15 years. I was homesick, having studied at Cambridge. And even though I knew in my heart I should and wanted to stay to work in the City of London, I had to come home. And I went back to Adelaide, where I began tutoring in economics, and I took a job as a researcher in economics in the Road Accident Research Unit. I did some accountancy subjects, and I stayed in Adelaide doing a major research project for the state government for the next 18 months.
Well, then you began your investment banking career with Schroders. And I suppose without knowing it at the time, that was really your first connection with Westpac, because if you go back some years, the original merchant bank in Australia was Darling and Company, which the Bank of New South Wales had a shareholding. And Darling and Company, the other one of the shareholders was Schroders, and it eventually became Schroder Darling and then eventually just Schroders. So that was your real first connection with Westpac. But tell me about your career then.
I'll tell you, my real first connection was at birth. I was given a Westpac bank account.
I can't beat that. I can't beat that. Mine was a Commonwealth Savings Bank account.
Actually, it wasn't Westpac then, was it? So I'm not quite right. So yes, Bank of New South Wales. Schroders, in that year that I came back to Adelaide and I was a researcher, I realised that research would not be for me. 12 months of writing this very detailed research program that I knew the output would sit on some politician's bottom bench. I thought I need something more, with more immediate feedback, and I'd heard about this thing called a money market. And I thought, I think that would give me more immediate feedback. And I managed a job in the money market at Schroders. That was in the very early 1980s. And everyone in this room will remember what the times were like in investment banking in the 80s. Suffice to say that the first 12 months on the money market desk at Schroders opened my eyes wider than many other things have ever opened it, because the times were times of growth. It was a boys' club. There were long lunches. This was not what I had expected. And indeed, I moved very quickly to the risk team within 12 months. And I had a very happy nearly 14 years in the risk team, and then ended up running the corporate desk of Schroders, and then ended up in the investment bank, in the investment management area. So I really moved around Schroders over that period.
Well, along came the 80s and the 90s. What was it like being at Schroders during those heady days?
Well, they were times of great growth. I loved Schroders. It was a bank with an English background. It wasn't quite the US investment bank style. I felt as if I fitted there. It was a learning period, very different from learning today, where people are given training programs. You were thrown into the deep end at Schroders, and I remember someone saying, get the letter of credit organised, and I'm thinking, oh my God, what's a letter of credit, and how do I do that? And there was nobody to ask, and you were thrown in there. And then we managed multi-currency loans, and so how am I going to do that? What do we do? And then we were managing liabilities my role was managing the big liability and asset portfolios for governments, semi-governments and large corporations. But it was really, I think the essence of it was I learnt on the job.
Well, now, while you were at Schroders, you married Dr. John Hewson, who had just become the Liberal member for Wentworth, appointed the Shadow Treasurer, and subsequently elected the leader of the federal opposition. That must have changed your life somewhat.
It certainly did. I don't think I was very astute or wise when it came to knowing what politics would be like. It was very busy. I remember innumerable occasions I would be at my desk at Schroders at 5. I'd need to get to Canberra for a function, and then I'd be back at my desk without anyone knowing. I never told anybody that I was doing this because it would have compromised my job, but I'd be back at my desk at Schroders by 8 the next morning, having flown to Canberra and caught that dreadful 6 a.m. flight back out of Canberra. I think the thing I remember is very, very, very few nights together at home, when you might consider them your television and slippers nights, perhaps 2 or 3 in a year. And that's what the next 8 years were like.
Well, then came that fateful year of 1993, when your former husband lost the so-called unlosable election. Tell us how you felt being so closely involved.
He had said to me 1 week before the election, we've lost this. And I, being the glass half full person, said, no, keep going. And the previous really 3 years in particular had been non-stop speeches, travel, and I was delivering multiple speeches for him, and I thought, he deserves this. He really, really deserves to win. And his honesty in putting forward the policies that he did probably cost him. However, after the election loss, while I was totally gutted for him, deep down inside, I knew that we could now have a life. And so the honest truth is, I could see a way forward. And I think probably it was harder for him to see the way forward than it was for me. So the public humiliation of that loss was difficult for both of us, but probably more difficult for him.
Must have been very hard. Well, after leaving Schroders in 1996, you embarked on a career as a non-executive director, and you must have had a sense of history, because I noticed that two of your earlier boards were AGL and CSR. AGL's only 20 years younger than the Bank of New South Wales, and I think CSR can be traced back to sort of the middle of the 1800s. Now, I've always believed that there's a big difference between management and the boardroom, and dare I say it, you were a woman. So what was it like going into the boardroom?
I remember my very first board was CSR. I remember at least 4 groups of people had taken credit for that appointment. I was on a lot of not-for-profit boards at the time, and one of the wives there said, I told my husband you'd be all right, you have me to thank for this. And then the M&A team at Schroders came up to me and they said, you have us to thank for your appointment on CSR. We told them you'd be all right. And the chairman had said he'd heard some speeches I'd given, and so I thanked him. And then I secretly thought it was because I'd done some work for CSR over time and maybe they wanted me for that. But I didn't fully understand then how different it would be, because you have to learn to sit on your hands. You have no responsibility for implementing what management are doing. So that took a little bit of getting used to. But my great love is strategy, and as a director, that's really what we're responsible for. So for me, this has been a privileged and wonderful career as a non-executive director, because I can focus on strategy, and the privilege of working for various companies, all of which have different strategic issues, is also a huge privilege. Being an only woman, well, that's changing. And certainly on the Westpac board, for most of the time that I was there, we had 3 women of 9 directors. In the beginning, I do remember at CSR, one of the directors saying to me, well, we certainly can't appoint another woman to this board, because you might go and powder your noses together. I did think that was rather odd, as the men all traipsed out together and did whatever they did, but I did think it was rather... I must say now I don't think about myself as being a woman on the board. And Frank, we've got time for one more question, because then I'm shopping it.
Well, I was going to ask you about your experience in the Westpac board, because, gosh, I wish you were there in 1992.
I wish I was too.
Because you saw 2 chief executives in that time, Dr. David Morgan and then Gail Kelly, and I know from my past experience they're 2 entirely different people.
Yes.
But what was your perspective of Westpac from looking down from the top?
I thought I was the luckiest person alive to be having offered a job on the board of Westpac. When I joined, David was the chief executive, and I think I could sum up the essence of the board and the senior management. It was all about academic and intellectual rigour. That was the focus. It was very, very academic and detailed. But times then changed, and David had a period of growth. He didn't face a GFC. Gail has come to the board, and she brings a wonderful capability, and while that academic rigour of the senior executive team has been moved towards more customer focus and a focus on doing the right thing by the customer, both of them really left a wonderful legacy for this bank.
Good. Thank you very much,
Thank
Carolyn
you.
Hewson.
Thank you.
Now this is
Well-
where she gets her own back.
I have been so excited about this possibility of interviewing Frank, and while so many of your former colleagues here, Frank, will know you well, and I know that particularly with Bob White in the room, this is incredibly special for me and for Frank. But I think we'd all be pleased to know where it began. I know that you were born in Western Australia to Patrick and Jean Conroy in 1942, and you had 2 sisters and a brother. But could you tell us about those early years?
Well, that was during wartime, of course, 1942, and I was told that I was 12 months old or more when my father saw me for the first time, because he was in the Air Force up at a very familiar place at the moment called Manus Island, as CEO of a base up there. And but my father had left school very, very early, as a lot did in those days, and as a lot did, joined the railways in Western Australia and became ultimately an engine driver. But when he came back from the war, having become an officer, he decided that wasn't for him, that side of life. And my mother and father bought a mixed business in a suburb called Hollywood in Western Australia. And that was at a time when rations were still on, so we used to get into trouble when a customer would come in and say, we'd like some chocolate, and my father would say, no, we haven't got any, because he was holding it for his special customers. And I remember my sister one day said, but Dad, there's some under the counter there. And then after about 3 years of that, they sold that business, and my father became what was known as an industrial officer for the employers, that is the ship owners, against all the, what we used to call the lumpers down on the wharf at Fremantle. And during the 50s, of course, there was a huge conflict on the wharf, so he spent a lot of his time in industrial court, totally non-legally trained, and but took it very seriously, and ultimately they reorganised all the labour, and he became the state manager of a stevedoring employers association. My brother, he was 10 years older than I. He joined the Commonwealth Bank, and my 2 sisters joined the National Bank. So at one stage, pardon me, sitting around the table were Commonwealth Bank, 2 National Bank people, and the Bank of New South Wales. And the one line, you always remember one-liners from your father. The one line my father always used to say was, you know, all you people from banks, and you can't rub 2 bob together, the whole lot. So we joined banks, and of course, the thing that I used to always remind my sisters was that I wasn't the first banker to be fired in our family. In fact, my 2 sisters were, because in those days, if you got married, you had to leave. And you remember that, don't you, some of you ladies? So that was so they actually were fired before I was.
So banking was in the DNA?
Banking was in the DNA. Much to my father's disgust, I have to tell you. He was very anti-banking at the time.
Frank,
Couldn't understand why we closed on Saturday mornings.
Frank, how old were you when you joined the Bank of New
Well, I joined at the age of 17, and the year I turned 17, and I joined the bank because I hadn't been successful at school, and the so-called leaving certificate that you sat for, which, as I told everyone last December, Bob was very successful and I wasn't, and I flunked it. And instead of having this many, many years of aspirations of being a school teacher, I decided, well, at least my father decided, that I was to join the bank, and having flunked out of school. So I was 17.
Well, it's just very wise advice that not the leaving certificate nor the NAP plan can guide what the future will hold. Now, unlike me, you married at the tender age of 23. You married Jeanette, or Jan as we know her. Many of you in this room will know what a wonderful partnership you have had. However, at that young age, you were working. You ended up studying both at the University of Western Australia and then at Macquarie University. How difficult was it to balance your job at Westpac, your young children, Brenda and Peter, and your study?
Well, it was very difficult, and those who've done part-time study know that, particularly if they're married with children. I call it the eternal triangle, where you've got the family and your work and the university in my case. And it was hard trying to balance those 3 demands, because invariably they get out of kilt, because at university you've got examinations, so there's an enormous amount of pressure there. I was in what was called the Chief Accountant's Office at one stage, where the half-yearly profit was always a big work peak period. So down would go the university, down would go the family, and you'd be concentrating on work. And so they were never in sync, ever. And that was always a problem. I know the kids, and I know this is very familiar with many of you, that my kids grew up with, shh, daddy's studying. And that was always the case.
Yeah. So it's not just women who balance the full tasks. You continued to work at Westpac in Western Australia through the 60s and 70s, and you showed a lot of early promise. I understand the signs of your stellar career to follow were evident even then, with the GM of Western Australia, Maitland James, describing you as... Maitland James described Frank as exceptional, with great future promise. By the late 70s, you had been transferred to Sydney. What did you do then?
Well, I was a country branch manager of Western Australia, and I got that magic phone call to say, how'd you like to go and have a look at a job in Sydney? And it was in this, as I mentioned earlier, the Chief Accountant's Office, as what was known then as the Manager Accounting, and it was responsible for the financial accounts, and we were announcing profits every half year then, and also drawing up the balance sheet for the year. And I guess I look back on that particular job that held me instead right through to the end, because it gave me a huge grounding in the accounts of the bank and how the bank operated. And of course it brought me into head office. So that was the role that brought me to Sydney in 1975.
Frank, one of your colleagues at the time described you as intense and driven, and says it was not by chance that you succeeded as you did. How do you reflect on those words, and what other words might you use to give us the essence of your success? But could you talk us through your work on committees, through banking inquiries, your work in Hong Kong and London?
Well, from the Chief Accountant's Department, my next appointment was into corporate planning and research, although Tony Adling always called it corporate research and planning because he loved the acronym CRAP, which really annoyed the hell out of me. So I was manager of planning in that area, and right at that time the major banks started to get very concerned about whether or not we should have deregulation. Bob was the chief executive, and I know Bob had a very strong view about the bank should be freed up from the very tight regulation the Reserve Bank had. So we created a subcommittee of the Australian Bankers Association among the four major banks, or five or six major banks then. The Commercial Bank and Commercial Banking Company of Sydney was involved as well. And we came up with a report to the Council of the ABA, the Australian Bankers Association, recommending that they push hard for deregulation. Well, there was an advisor to the Treasurer at the time, a chap by the name of Dr. Hewson, pushed very hard for John Howard to push, in turn, the Prime Minister to announce the Campbell inquiry. And that's what actually occurred as a result of the work, I think, that was done in the ABA. But there were other pressures around the market as well. From there, I was appointed to London for 2 years, and that was my introduction to wholesale banking. We went into corporate banking over there, and there's some colleagues, former colleagues here today that were over there with me. And that was a tremendous insight to how the Euromoney and the international markets operated. We were doing syndicated loans and big monies being going out, and it was quite a... And we had some good domestic English company clients as well, or customers, as we should call them in the bank, of course. And we had good relationships with them. So it was 2 years of hard work, but very interesting work. Came back into a very rapidly growing corporate banking division. So that was the sort of circle. And then when I became General Manager of Corporate Banking Division, Stuart Fowler was my boss then, of Head of Corporate and International, decided that this young fellow in Hong Kong needed to be brought back into the system, Philip Deere. I have another view of that. I think Stuart wanted to get rid of me out of Sydney. And so Philip and I swapped jobs. I went up to become General Manager of Asian Division, based in Hong Kong, and Philip came back to be General Manager of Corporate Banking.
That gives us a sense of the diversity of your experience, but I now want to jump to the 1st of October, 1991. It was the day that you were appointed as MD of Westpac as the bank approached its 175th birthday. Can you describe for us what the economic environment was like at